The Ghost on the Bridge. The room smelled like bureaucracy and old coffee, row upon row of dark wood paneling, fluorescent lights humming their indifferent song, men in suits arranged behind a long curved table, their faces arranged in expressions that cost their constituents several $100,000 a year to maintain. Senate Armed Services Committee Room SD-G50 Dirksen Senate Office Building. Washington, D.C., March 7, 2024. Senator Harold Briggs of Virginia leaned into his microphone with the posture of a man who had rehearsed his gravity in a mirror that morning. He was 71 years old, white-haired, decorated with the kind of gravitas that accumulates when you have held power long enough that people stop questioning whether you deserve it. He opened a manila folder. He read without looking up. On the morning of November 14, 2023, at Naval Cyber Systems Facility, designate NCS Cerberus, Fallon Naval Air Station, Nevada, a Category 5 systems, failure initiated at 0758 hours. According to the post-incident technical review, unchecked, the failure would have resulted in catastrophic cryogenic venting within the facility's primary command structure. Total estimated loss of the quantum processing core, $4.7 billion. Estimated loss of classified wargaming scenarios and fleet simulation data, irreplaceable. He paused. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when the people inside them already know the ending, but are waiting for the official version. The failure was resolved at 0809 hours, 11 minutes. Briggs looked up for the first time. By a single individual, an individual who was not listed on the facility's command roster for that date, who carried no visible rank or identification, and who, according to 3 sworn witness statements, had been physically restrained by the facility's commanding officer approximately 12 minutes before the crisis began. He closed the folder. He set it down with the careful precision of a man who understood the weight of paper. The committee would like to understand, he said, how that is possible. Nobody answered him directly, but somewhere in a different room in a different building, 1,200 miles to the west, the answer had been etched into the steel wall of a command deck. A small brass plate screwed into a server rack bulkhead. Simple, understated. It read Admiral's Corner. This is the story of how that plate got there. Fallon Naval Air Station sits in the middle of the Nevada desert like a secret that the landscape is actively trying to bury. Drive west from the town of Fallon on Route 50, the loneliest highway in America according to the sign, and the sign does not lie. The desert opens up in every direction with the kind of indifference that reminds you how small your concerns really are. The mountains in the distance are gray and impassive. The sagebrush does not care about your problems. The sky is the color of nothing in particular. The base itself you can find on a map if you know to look for it. The main airfield, the carrier landing training facilities. The culture of people who are very good at very dangerous things and are not especially interested in discussing it at parties. But NCS Cerberus is not on any map you can access. It sits 3 miles east of the main base perimeter, behind 2 separate checkpoint gates behind fencing that does not announce what it is protecting behind a security protocol that requires 6 separate forms of authorization just to schedule a visit. The building itself is low, long, and deliberately unimpressive from the outside. Beige concrete. No windows on the ground level. A parking lot with 47 spaces, 11 of them occupied on most mornings. From the outside, it looks like the kind of building that stores maintenance equipment. From the inside, it is the brain. NCS Cerberus is the most advanced naval cyber warfare simulation facility in the world. Within its server halls and its climate-controlled command decks, the U.S. Navy fights every war. It might someday have to fight fighting it first in code and light and digital fire, trying to find the weaknesses. Before the weaknesses, find them in the real world. It runs hundreds of simulations a year. It processes more classified data in a single week than most agencies handle in a fiscal quarter. The facility was designed by a team of 17 engineers and systems architects over a period of 4 years. It was completed and brought online in phases, the final phase version 2.0, the quantum core reaching operational status in the spring of 2011. The primary architect was a Navy commander at the time, a woman nobody outside the classified world had heard of. Her name is not important yet. What is important is that she built the place, knew every line of its foundational code, knew where the walls were thin and where they were strong, knew what the system could withstand, and knew with a precision that would later prove important exactly what it could not. She had put all of that knowledge into a file, a technical memo, March 19, 2019. The memo was forwarded to Cerberus Command. It was logged as received. It was marked reviewed. And then it was placed into an archive folder on a server that no one opened again for 4 years. But that comes later. Captain Reed Harlan had the kind of face that looked good on a command deck. 44 years old, 6 feet even, jaw like a corner that had been squared by someone who believed in precision. His hair was dark going gray at the temples in the way that suggests authority on men who have it and desperation on men who don't. Harlan had it, or he had learned to wear it well enough that the distinction had become irrelevant. He had come up through surface warfare, destroyers, then cruisers. He had a combat tour in the Gulf and a second deployment to the Pacific that didn't make the official record for reasons that remained at the discretion of his evaluating officers. His fitness reports were excellent. His political instincts were better. He knew which admirals to stand near, at which functions, knew which assignments to pursue, and which to decline, knew, with an intuition that was almost musical, how to position himself in the current of a career so that the current did the work. He had arrived at Cerberus 14 months ago. He had arrived as he always did, ready to be impressive. There is a photograph from his change of command ceremony framed and hanging in the main corridor of the facility's administrative wing. In it, Harlan is shaking hands with the outgoing commander, a quiet man who had run Cerberus for 3 years, with the low-key competence of someone who had decided somewhere along the way that he would rather be good at his job than be recognized for it. The outgoing commander is smiling in the photograph. It is a small smile, the kind that contains information. Harlan is smiling broadly. He is already looking slightly past the camera. In his office, above the desk on the wall where commanding officers tend to hang the things that define them, Harlan had placed 3 items: his Naval Academy commission certificate, his combat deployment citation from the Gulf, and a letter of commendation framed in dark cherry wood bearing the letterhead of the Department of the Navy and the signature at the bottom in firm blue ink, Rear Admiral Everett R. Cole, USN, Dam, Neck Annex, Virginia, September 12, 1998. Harlan had received it as a junior officer a year out of Annapolis during a systems evaluation exercise at the Navy's cyber training facility in Dam Neck. He had scored in the 94th percentile on the systems analysis assessment. He had been proud of that score for exactly as long as it took him to realize that 94 percentile meant almost nothing to the people who designed the test. But the commendation had felt real. It had felt like recognition from someone who mattered. He had kept it for 25 years. He had never looked up who Admiral Everett Cole was beyond the signature. The name was a credential, not a person. Harlan operated that way more often than he knew. The morning of November 14th began the way most significant mornings begin, which is to say it did not announce itself. 0600, Cerberus Command Deck. The facility running its pre-Black Spear checklist with the focused efficiency of a crew that had done this many times. Black Spear was the facility's most complex annual wargame scenario, a full-spectrum, simulated naval engagement involving 17 separate theater commands, 4 allied nation data feeds, and a threat matrix so layered that it took 3 weeks to build and 22 hours to run. The crew had been preparing for 6 days. Ensign Declan Mercer arrived at 0615 and went directly to his station at Secondary Systems Analysis Port, Side Row 2. He was 24 years old. He had been at Cerberus for 7 months. Before that, 2 years at the Navy's Advanced Cyber Training Pipeline in Pensacola, which he had completed with distinction, but without the kind of loud distinction that got you noticed quickly. He was the kind of officer who asked questions before acting, which in some commands was considered a strength, and in this one it was considered a sign of insufficient confidence. He had learned to keep the questions mostly to himself. He had not stopped having them. He set his coffee down black. No sugar poured from the command deck's single functional coffee maker, and pulled up the morning system diagnostics. Everything nominal, everything green. The quantum core was running at 96.3% efficiency within standard parameters for pre-exercise warm-up. He scanned the overnight logs. He was thorough in a way that no one had specifically asked him to be, out of a habit that had no name yet, but would later be recognized by people who understood these things as the habit of someone who actually understood the systems they were operating rather than simply operating them. He found nothing unusual. He drank his coffee. He did not know at 0615 that within 2 hours the command deck would be in total crisis, that every system around him would be burning in electronic fire, and that the only reason he and 42 other people would walk out of that building alive was the quiet competence of a woman in a plain olive drab flight suit who was at that precise moment 94 miles away in a rental car driving west on Route 50 with a tablet in the passenger seat and a technical memo from 4 years ago open on the screen. She drove the way she did most things, without waste. Diana Cole was 52 years old, and she did not look like what she was, which was intentional. She was not tall, not small either, but not the kind of presence that filled a doorframe. Medium height, dark hair cut short and practical. A face that had settled into the clarity that comes to people who have spent decades knowing exactly what they think and not spending much energy on the performance of thinking it. She was wearing an olive drab flight suit with no rank, no name tape, no insignia of any kind. Clean pressed functional. She looked like someone's logistical support staff. She looked like someone who had wandered out of a supply depot. She looked to anyone who did not look carefully like no one worth a second glance. She had cultivated that. On the passenger seat, a government-issued tablet, a coiled data cable in a small nylon pouch, a bottle of water she had not opened, and a single printed document, 4 pages slightly dog-eared at the corner of page 3. The document was a copy of the technical memo she had filed in March of 2019, 4 years and 8 months ago, detailing a specific structural vulnerability in Protocol Omega, the Cerberus facility's emergency isolation failsafe. The memo had been submitted through proper channels, logged, marked reviewed, archived. She had requested a status update 6 months after filing. No response. Requested again a year later. Received a form acknowledgement. Had sent a third query in January of 2022. The response when it came was a form letter from someone in the administrative office who clearly had no technical background and who had confirmed with the breezy confidence of someone who does not know what they do not know that all protocol systems at NCS Cerberus were functioning within operational parameters. She had been patient. She was not by nature especially patient, but she had learned over the course of a career spent doing classified work in rooms that did not officially exist, that the most effective way to address institutional inertia was usually not to fight it directly. You waited. You documented. You made sure that when the thing you warned about happened, the record was clean and the path forward was clear. She was done waiting now. She had not called ahead. She had not scheduled the visit through the normal liaison process, which would have triggered a 48-hour notification to Cerberus Command. She had obtained a standard civilian visitor authorization under a consultant review protocol, a level of access that allowed entry to non-classified administrative areas, and with an escort, certain technical spaces. It was not the access level that matched her actual authority. That was the point. She wanted to see the facility the way the facility actually was, not the way it would be dressed up to be when a flag officer was known to be coming. She turned off Route 50 onto the access road at 0722. The desert on both sides was flat and pale and absolute. At the first checkpoint, she showed her ID. The guard checked the visitor authorization. Took longer than it should have. Called inside. Someone confirmed. He waved her through with the lack of ceremony that security personnel apply to people they have determined do not matter. She drove on. 0742. Harlan was on the command deck doing what Harlan did best, which was being present in a way that required other people to notice his presence. He moved through the pre-exercise preparations with his hands clasped behind his back and his posture set to a specific angle that conveyed engaged oversight without suggesting that he was anxious about anything. He was good at the theater of command. The command deck of NCS Cerberus was a cavern of contained intelligence. Server racks lined the walls, their indicator lights pulsing in soft blues and greens like the breathing of something large and patient. The main holographic display dominated the center of the space, a three-dimensional map of the Pacific Theater, currently showing the baseline scenario for Black Spear 17 fleet groups arranged across 40,000 square miles of simulated ocean, waiting for the exercise to begin. The temperature was exactly 68 degrees. It was always exactly 68 degrees. 41 personnel on the command deck that morning, officers and enlisted technicians. The average age was 31. The average time in service was 9 years. They were good at their jobs in the way that people who have been selected, trained, and filtered through a rigorous pipeline tend to be good at their ones, technically competent, procedurally reliable, and not particularly practiced at handling situations that fell outside the procedures they had been trained for. Harlan was walking the port side when the call came from the security desk. Civilian visitor. Female, mid-40s to mid-50s. Visitor badge administrative access, authorization requesting escort to technical review areas. Claimed to be a systems consultant, no advanced scheduling. Harlan frowned. Today of all days, pre-exercise morning, he didn't need a civilian wandering around the command deck with a notepad getting in the way, asking questions that would require someone to stop what they were doing to answer them. He told the desk to let her in with a basic escort and keep her out of the core spaces. He went back to his walkthrough. She came in through the secondary entrance corridor. The escort was a petty officer named Whitfield, who was clearly running on not enough sleep and doing his best to be professional about it. He walked her through the administrative wing, mentioned the technical review spaces were through the main command deck, and then got a message on his radio that pulled him back toward the checkpoint desk. He told her to wait in the corridor. She waited for approximately 30 seconds. Then she walked through the door into the command deck. She did not walk fast. She did not walk slow. She walked the way she always walked, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had already decided how long she was willing to take to get there. She moved to the primary command node and stopped. She opened her tablet. She began to read. Declan Mercer noticed her at 0747. He noticed her the way he noticed most things: a brief registration, a quick assessment, a mental note filed without immediate interpretation. Woman, civilian or close to it, no rank visible, flight suit, no markings. Standing at the primary command node, reading from a tablet with the focused attention of someone who was finding the information interesting rather than someone who was pretending to find it interesting. He went back to his diagnostics. Then he looked up again. There was something about the way she was standing. He couldn't name it. He filed the observation for later. Harlan saw her at 0751. He was coming around the starboard side of the main holographic display, running through the Black Spear pre-authorization checklist with a lieutenant when he caught her in his peripheral vision. A woman he didn't recognize, standing at the primary command node operating a tablet, apparently undisturbed by the fact that she was standing in the most sensitive position on the most sensitive command deck in the Western Hemisphere with a civilian visitor badge. He felt the flash of irritation that was his, tell the thing that came before the performance of authority, the thing that fed it. He walked toward her. The junior officers and enlisted technicians closest to the primary node felt the change in the room before they understood it. The way air pressure shifts before weather. Ma'am? She didn't look up. Ma'am? Louder now, his voice carrying across the deck. I don't know what low-level intelligence billet you wandered out of, but this is the Fleet Cybernetics command deck. This is the heart of this warship. It is not a library for civilian analysts to get lost in. He stopped 3 feet away. His voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted to make a point feel personal. So take your coffee and your little notepad and walk out the same way you came in before you spill something on a console that costs more than your entire education. Across the deck, the laughter came. Nervous, quiet, but present. The woman did not look up. Her finger traced a complex schematic on the tablet screen. She was looking at something in the system architecture display a layer deep enough that most of the people in the room wouldn't have known where to find it. Harlan's jaw tightened. Are you deaf? Still nothing. Something in him moved past irritation into something colder. He closed the distance in 2 strides. His hand came out and took her arm, not gently, and he used his size and his leverage to spin her and press her back against the nearest surface, which was the cold steel face of a server rack bulkhead. The impact was soft, but the echo of it moved through the room like a stone dropped into still water. The laughter stopped. He leaned in. His voice was low now, controlled but not calm. I gave you a lawful order. This is a restricted area. Identify yourself and your purpose here, right now, or I will have you in the brig so fast your head will spin. The woman's eyes came up from the tablet. They were gray, the gray of overcast water on a cold morning, not dark, not light. Somewhere in the middle, entirely still. They held no fear, no anger, no surprise. They held the quality of someone who has encountered the thing in front of them before, classified it, and moved on to thinking about what comes next. She looked at him, he looked at her. And across the deck, standing near the port side secondary systems row, Declan Mercer saw something that he would spend several years afterward trying to accurately describe in a way that didn't sound like something he had invented. He saw her brace against the wall, not with fear, not with shock, with balance. A low, specific balance weight, settled center of gravity, unshifted, like someone who was choosing not to use what they had available. Like someone who had decided in a fraction of a second that there was a reason not to respond to what had just been done to them. He did not know what that reason was. He looked down at the wall she had been pushed against. There was a small stainless steel nameplate affixed to the face of the server rack bulkhead. Standard issue, black lettering on brushed steel, inventory designation. It read, Coal Architecture Module 7. Mercer looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at it again. He did not speak. He filed it. The way he filed everything careful, quiet, waiting for the moment it would make sense. In the corner by the aft entrance where the shadows gathered around the base of a dormant diagnostic terminal, Commodore Clifton Weston stood without moving. He was 62 years old, 38 years in the United States Navy. He had commanded a destroyer squadron in the North Atlantic, had run strike group operations in the Gulf, had served at NAVSEA and at NAVWAR, and at two positions that had no public title. His hair was entirely white now. His face was the face of a man who had spent decades deciding what to say and when to say nothing. He had been in his office when the security desk flagged the visitor. He had come to the command deck out of habit, the habit of a man who had learned that what you could not see from your office was usually more important than what you could. He had arrived in time to see the confrontation. He had not intervened, not because he had nothing to say, because he was watching something and he was not yet sure he was right about what he was watching. He watched the woman get pushed against the wall. He watched her brace, and then he knew. Not from the file he had in his memory, not from the photographs he had seen in classified briefings. He knew from something older and more direct than that. He knew from the body, the specific, unmistakable stillness of a person standing against forced weight, low spine in a line and completely controlled. He had seen that exact posture once before in his life. Dam Neck Annex, Virginia, autumn 1997. A Saturday morning, the systems evaluation lab running a hardware diagnostic that had gone sideways into a partial failure. Everyone else in the room had moved back from the failing console instinct being to create distance from something that was breaking. One person had moved forward. Captain Everett Cole, USN. 43 years old at the time, and already the best systems mind Weston had ever personally encountered. He had walked to the failing console with that walk, that specific, quiet, unhurried walk, and braced in front of it exactly the way a person who has decided what they are going to do braces before they do it. He had fixed it in 7 minutes. Weston had served under Everett Cole for 14 months. He had watched him operate in situations that would have broken most people. He had gone to the funeral in 2014. He had read the obituary that listed among the surviving family one daughter, Diana, naval officer, career classified. Weston looked at the woman against the wall. He began to move, slowly, toward the aft entrance. There were things he needed to do before the room found out what it had just done to itself. On the main holographic display at 07 to 56, something happened. A single line of code appeared in the upper left quadrant of the display. Crimson on blue. A small anomaly in the data stream. The kind of thing that happens in complex systems and usually means nothing. Usually. Ensign Declan Mercer, who had been watching the nameplate on the wall and trying to understand what it meant, felt a change in his diagnostic feed. A small hiccup. A 3% fluctuation in the quantum core's thermal regulation cycle. He looked at it. He looked at the woman against the wall. He looked at the fluctuation. Something cold moved through him. He reached for his keyboard. He was not fast enough. At 0758, Protocol Omega engaged, and the world inside NCS Cerberus began to end. What matters here in this first part of the story is what had been put in place long before that morning. What had been built and forgotten and ignored and archived. What had been carried for 4 years in a memo that nobody read, and for 25 years in a commendation on an office wall, and for a lifetime in the posture of a woman who had learned everything she knew from a man who had built this place in all but the literal sense. What matters is the architecture of the system, and the architecture of the person standing inside it. Both of them built by the same hands. Both of them on the morning of November 14th, 2023, waiting for the same thing. For someone to finally understand what they were looking. The first alarm was almost polite about it. A single tone. Not the klaxon. Not the cascading wail that everyone in a military facility learns to fear the way they learn to fear certain silences. Just a soft ascending chime from the main environmental control panel, the kind of sound that in a normal morning would have drawn a technician's attention for 30 seconds before being diagnosed as a sensor fluctuation and cleared. This was not a normal morning. Ensign Declan Mercer heard it and was already moving before he understood why. Something in the sequence was wrong, not the tone itself, but the way it was followed a half-second later by a second tone from a completely separate system, and then a third from the quantum core thermal monitoring array, and then the three sounds were no longer separate sounds, but the beginning of something larger, a chorus assembling itself from instruments that were never supposed to play together. He looked at his diagnostic screen. The 3% thermal fluctuation he had seen 11 seconds ago was now 14%, and climbing. Sir, his voice was level. He had not yet decided whether to be afraid. We have a thermal anomaly in the quantum core. It's escalating. Captain Reed Harlan, who was still standing 3 feet from the woman he had pinned against the server rack, turned his head toward Mercer with the expression of a man who has been interrupted during something he considered more important. Run the standard diagnostic. Sir, I am running it. The system isn't responding to the diagnostic query. I'm locked out of the thermal regulation interface. The word locked landed in the room with different weight than the word usually carries. Harlan let go of the woman's arm. He turned fully toward the command deck. And then Protocol Omega engaged. It did not engage gradually. It did not give the room a moment to prepare. It came down like a curtain dropped from a great height, total and immediate. And the effect on the command deck systems was the effect that a stone wall has on water moving at speed. Everything that had been flowing stopped. Every console that had been active went dark for a single breathless second, and then came back displaying not its operational interface, but a single line of red text on a black screen repeating across every surface in the room simultaneously. Protocol Omega engaged. All command functions locked. System isolation active. The main holographic display, which had been showing the serene pre-exercise arrangement of the Black Spear scenario, dissolved. The 17 fleet groups, the simulated Pacific Theater, the 40,000 square miles of digital ocean, all of it collapsed inward and was replaced by a storm of red static, three-dimensional and churning, filling the center of the command deck like something that had been waiting behind the display all along. The lights changed. The clean operational blue of the overhead strips flickered once, twice, and then shifted into emergency red, and the command deck that had been a place of focused professional competence became in the space of 4 seconds something that looked considerably more like a disaster. The synthesized voice of the facility's emergency management system came through the overhead speakers with the calm of a machine that has no stake in whether the people listening to it survive. System integrity compromised. Protocol Omega engaged. Core isolation sequence initiated. All command functions restricted pending security verification. For a moment, the room was silent in the way that rooms get silent when people are processing information that doesn't fit inside the frameworks they have prepared for it. Then it stopped being silent. Report, Harlan's voice clipped. His hands were at his sides. His face was a mask he was holding in place with considerable effort. Somebody tell me what I'm looking at. A lieutenant at the primary command console, a woman named Aldridge, who had been at Cerberus for 3 years and had never seen anything like this, turned toward him with a face the color of old paper. Sir, the system has locked us out completely. I can't access any primary control surface. The isolation protocol has sealed the core architecture. We can't override from any manned station. Get the system engineers. The comms are down internally, sir. The isolation sealed the internal network. Use a phone. The landlines run through the same network. Harlan looked at her. She looked at him. The gap between what he had expected this morning to be and what it had become was widening by the second, and the sound it made as it widened was the sound of more alarms joining the chorus, each one from a different corner of the command deck, each one adding its particular voice to an emergency that was no longer theoretical. Mercer had his hands moving across his keyboard in the careful, methodical way of someone who does know what they're doing and is beginning to understand that knowing is not enough. He pulled up every diagnostic pathway available to his station. Each one returned the same response. Locked, isolated, unavailable. He tried the maintenance access layer. Locked. He tried the secondary engineering interface. Locked. He tried a manual terminal reset sequence he had learned in Pensacola during a training exercise on legacy systems, a sequence old enough that it predated Protocol Omega's architecture by 6 years and therefore might in theory exist outside its lockdown parameters. The screen went dark, came back, still locked. He sat back for a moment and thought about that. Then the emergency voice returned, and what it said changed the temperature of every person on the command deck in a way that had nothing to do with the facility's climate control. Containment field breach imminent. Core coolant systems offline. Cryogenic venting sequence will initiate in T-14 minutes without manual override. Evacuate. Evacuate. The helium. Mercer knew what that meant before Harlan did because Mercer had actually read the facility's emergency operations manual during his second week at Cerberus, not because he was required to, but because it had seemed like information worth having. The quantum processing core at NCS Cerberus was kept operational by a coolant system that circulated liquid helium at -452 degrees Fahrenheit through a network of superconducting pathways. The system was designed with multiple redundancies. It was not designed to vent into a sealed command space. If the coolant system vented into the command deck in its current sealed state, the temperature in the room would drop below survivable parameters in under 4 minutes. 14 minutes to override. In a room where every system was locked, with a crew that was increasingly operating on the wrong side of panic. Harlan was at the command chair now, pulling at systems that did not respond, his voice growing with each failed attempt, louder and less controlled. The theater of authority converting itself into something raw, and finding in that conversion that there was less substance underneath than he had understood there to be. He was shouting into a comms panel that was dark. He was issuing orders to technicians whose consoles were inert. He was a captain on a ship that was sinking, and the thing he had spent his career learning how to do was command the ship, and commanding the ship was no longer possible. Near the main door, a young lieutenant named Coates was attempting to force the emergency exit release. The door was reinforced steel, rated for ballistic containment, and the hydraulic system that controlled it was part of the network that Protocol Omega had locked. He was putting his full weight into a lever that was not going to move, and the effort was serving no purpose except to make the people watching him feel that someone was doing something. No one on the command deck was actually doing anything useful, except one person. She had not moved from the bulkhead. From the moment Protocol Omega had engaged to this moment, Dinah Cole had remained exactly where Harlan had left her, standing against the face of the server rack, her back against the steel, her tablet still open in her hands. She had watched the crisis unfold across the command deck with the same gray still attention she had been giving the system schematics when Harlan had interrupted her. Not detached, not unconcerned, observing. The way a surgeon observes a patient before making a decision, because accurate observation is the prerequisite for accurate action, and rushing that step does not save time, it costs it. She was watching the holographic display. Specifically, she was watching the pattern of the red static that had replaced the black spear scenario. Most people in the room were seeing it as chaos, the visual representation of a system failure noise without signal. She was seeing something else. The static was not random, it had a structure, a recursive one, a pattern that repeated at intervals of approximately 11 seconds, cycling through a sequence that she recognized the way you recognize a piece of music you wrote yourself when someone else is playing it wrong. She looked at the tablet in her hands. She looked at the secondary engineering terminal on the portside wall 12 feet away. Dark, ignored. The technicians had clustered around the main command consoles, the obvious centers of power, the places you went when you needed to fix something important. Nobody went to the secondary terminal because it was in normal operations, a peripheral, a maintenance access point, not a command surface. She had designed it that way on purpose. She crossed the 12 feet in the time it takes to decide to cross them. The secondary terminal's housing was standard gray composite mounted flush with the wall. Below the main screen, behind a hinged access panel marked maintenance only, was a row of shielded data ports. She opened the panel. She reached into the pouch on her flight suit and removed the coiled data cable, standard at one end, proprietary at the other. The proprietary end machined to a specification that existed in exactly one document, and that document was classified. She plugged one end into the terminal's maintenance port. She plugged the other end into her tablet. She began to work. Declan Mercer saw her from across the room. He saw the cable. He saw the maintenance port. He saw the tablet screen come alive with something that was not any interface he had ever seen, not any display architecture. He had been trained on a river of code scrolling upward faster than he could read it, dense and layered and structured, in a way that he could tell even without understanding it was not improvised. This was not someone trying things. This was someone doing something specific. He stood up from his station. He moved toward her. He did not know why. He moved on instinct, and the instinct was the same one that had made him look at the nameplate on the wall, the same one that had made him notice the way she stood after Harlan had pushed her. The instinct of someone who had learned to pay attention to things that didn't fit the pattern, because the things that didn't fit the pattern were usually the things that mattered. He stopped 5 feet behind her and watched. Her fingers moved across the tablet surface in a way he had never seen anyone move across a tablet surface. Not typing, not navigating. Something between the two, a fluid sequence of gestures that looked almost like a language in itself, a physical vocabulary developed through years of using the same tool for the same purpose, until the tool and the intention had merged into a single expression. She was not fighting the system. He understood that immediately and with complete clarity. She was talking to it. She was speaking to it in its own language, going below the locked interface to the layer where the language lived, the layer where the commands that Protocol Omega had sealed away were still there, still present, still capable of responding to someone who knew how to ask. The code on her screen scrolled and changed. She traced a sequence with 2 fingers. The scroll stopped. She was looking at something specific now. A block of code she had isolated from the cascade, and Mercer, standing close enough to see the screen over her shoulder, could see the block, but could not read it at the speed it was moving, except for 2 characters near the beginning of the sequence. PO Protocol Omega. She had found it. The memo she had written in March of 2019 had described the vulnerability in 17 pages of technical language that the person who archived it had never read. The short version was this. Protocol Omega, in its standard configuration, contained a flaw in the way it processed a specific type of data packet used exclusively in the Black Spear wargame scenario. When that packet was present in the system at the moment, Omega engaged the protocol, misread the packet's energy signature as evidence of an ongoing external attack. It then responded to that misreading by escalating its own lockdown, which generated more anomalous readings, which it misread as further evidence of attack, which escalated the lockdown further, a loop feeding on itself, compounding the crisis with every cycle, until the system's interpretation of its own defensive action became indistinguishable from the thing it was defending against. She had seen this coming in 2019. She was correcting it now. But correcting the recursive loop was only part of the problem. Protocol Omega's lockdown was self-sealing. Once engaged, it could not be terminated from any standard command interface. The only exit was a master override, and the master override was exactly what the lockdown had been designed to prevent. In a real attack scenario, this made sense. In a scenario where the lockdown itself was the crisis, it was a trap with no door, except for the door that had been built before the lock existed. At 0806, Diana Cole reached a specific coordinate in the facility's architecture, a pathway that did not appear in any current technical document. A segment of code written in 2011 during the Cerberus Visho 2.0 completion process, embedded below the standard operating layer at a depth that no routine maintenance sweep would reach, sitting there unchanged for 12 years waiting. She had always known it was there. She had put it there. The sequence required to activate it was not a password. It was a gesture, a specific series of inputs that corresponded to nothing in the standard interface documentation, because the inputs had been designed by someone who thought in systems the way other people think in music, intuitively, structurally, from the inside out. 22 distinct commands executed in a precise order over approximately 90 seconds. She had not practiced it in 12 years. She did not hesitate. Her fingers moved through the sequence with the ease of something known long enough that it had passed through memory into the body entirely the way a person who has played the same piece of music for decades can play it in the dark, in a different room, in a different life, and find that their hands remember what their mind has stopped consciously holding. 22 commands, 90 seconds. And on the tablet screen in the line of code that opened the pathway, a name appeared. Not a system designation, not an alphanumeric identifier. A name. Protocol Everett. Mercer was close enough to see it. He saw it for approximately 2 seconds before the next command cleared the screen and moved the sequence forward. He stood very still. He thought about the nameplate. Cole Architecture Module 7. He thought about the commendation on Harlan's wall, the one he had seen during his first week at Cerberus when Harlan had given the new arrivals a tour that was largely a tour of Harlan's own achievements. He thought about the signature at the bottom. Rear Admiral Everett R. Cole Gussin. He thought about the woman in front of him, 52 years old in a plain flight suit with no name on it. He thought about the name on the screen. He did not say anything. He stood behind her and watched, and what he watched in the next 3 minutes was the kind of thing that a person who has spent their career genuinely trying to understand systems rather than simply operate them recognizes on a level below language. He was watching someone think at a depth that made everything he had seen in 7 months at Cerberus look like the surface of a very deep lake. But before she could complete the sequence, Harlan noticed her. He was at the command chair out of immediate options, his voice hoarse from issuing commands that his crew could not execute, and he looked across the command deck and saw a woman he had physically removed from his primary command node, now standing at a secondary terminal with a cable plugged into the maintenance system, and the sight of it moved through his processing faster than thought, bypassing analysis and arriving directly at reflex. "What are you doing?" Not a question, a statement aimed like a weapon. He was already moving. "Get away from that terminal. You'll make it worse." She did not look up. He crossed the deck in 7 strides. He reached for her arm, the same arm he had used before, the same motion with the same intention. Declan Mercer stepped in front of him. He did it without planning it. He was simply there between Harlan and the woman, and Harlan stopped because a body had appeared in his path and his momentum had not accounted for the possibility. Mercer was younger than Harlan by 20 years. He was junior by a distance that in the United States Navy is not a small thing. He had no authority to stand where he was standing, and he knew it, and he stood there anyway. "Sir." His voice was not loud, it was not angry. It had the specific, quiet steadiness of someone who has decided something and is no longer deliberating. "Don't." One word after that. "Don't." Not an order, not a challenge. A fact delivered in the tone of someone stating something obvious. Harlan looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Harlan. And then something happened on the main holographic display, something small but visible to everyone on the command deck, a single thread of white light appearing in the upper right quadrant of the red static, thin as a wire, perfectly straight, drawing itself slowly and with absolute precision into a shape. A circle. Clean. Unbroken. Expanding outward from its center with the quiet authority of geometry, asserting itself against chaos. The technicians closest to the display stopped what they were doing. Lieutenant Aldridge turned from the command console. Even Harlan turned. The white circle grew, and as it grew, the red static it touched did not fight it. The static simply retreated, pulled back from the boundary of the circle like something that recognized the shape and understood what it meant. Inside the circle, the display was clearing the noise, organizing itself back into signal, the chaos reconstructing itself into the beginning of order. At 0807, the first alarm stopped. Not faded. Stopped. A clean termination, as if someone had simply decided it was no longer necessary. The silence where the alarm had been was so sudden and so complete that 3 technicians physically flinched. At 0808, the emergency voice cut off mid-sentence. "Cryogenic venting sequence will initiate in T-6 minutes. Silence. The red static on the holographic display retreated to the edges and then collapsed inward in a single smooth motion like a tide pulling back from a shore, and where the static had been, the Black Spear scenario reappeared. 17 fleet groups. The Pacific Theater. 40,000 square miles of simulated ocean, exactly as it had been at 0742, exactly as it had been designed to be. Clean, complete, unbroken. The console displays came back one by one, operational status replacing error messages, green replacing red, the healthy hum of the coolant system returning to the room like the sound of a living thing resuming its breathing after a stillness that had gone on much too long. The overhead lights shifted from emergency red back to operational blue. 0809, 11 minutes from engagement to resolution. The command deck of NCS Cerberus was silent in a way it had never been silent before. Not the silence before a crisis. Not the silence after an argument. The silence of 41 people who have just watched something happen that they do not have the vocabulary to describe, standing in the room where it happened, not yet ready to start finding words. She unplugged the cable. She coiled it with practiced efficiency, a single smooth loop, and tucked it back into the pouch on her flight suit. She looked at the holographic display for a moment, not long, just long enough to confirm what she already knew. Then she turned. She looked at Reed Harlan. He was standing beside the command chair. His hands were at his sides. His face, which had this morning arranged itself into the confident architecture of command, had come apart into something rawer and less controlled. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has understood that he is missing the most important piece of information in the room and has not yet found a way to frame the question. She met his eyes. She did not speak. The reinforced steel door at the aft entrance opened with the hydraulic sigh of a system that had returned to normal function. The sound it made was the sound of a different part of the story beginning. Commodore Clifton Weston walked through it. He was not rushing. He had stopped rushing the moment he had confirmed from the remote monitor in his office that the crisis was resolving. He walked the length of the command deck at the pace of a man who has made his decision and is moving toward it without theater. 2 armed Marines from the base security detail flanked him at a respectful distance, not because he had asked for them, but because they had met him in the corridor and he had not told them to stop. He surveyed the room, the faces, the equipment, the holographic display running its peaceful Black Spear scenario above the silent crew. He looked at Harlan for a moment, a look that contained everything it needed to contain, and then moved on. He walked directly to the secondary engineering terminal. He stopped 3 feet from the woman in the plane flight suit. He drew himself to his full height and executed a salute. Not the casual gesture of equals acknowledging each other, not the brisk, functional salute of routine military courtesy. The kind of salute that a man renders when he is standing in front of someone whose authority and achievement are so far beyond the requirement of the gesture that the gesture itself becomes an act of personal meaning rather than protocol. His back was straight, his eyes were forward, his arm was precise. Admiral Cole, his voice carried across the deck without effort, not because he raised it, but because the room was so quiet that a whisper would have done the same. My apologies for the reception. I was not informed of your personal visit today. A beat. This facility is yours to command. The word, Admiral, it moved through the room the way sound moves through water, reaching everyone at the same moment, arriving before any individual could prepare for it. And the response was not a single reaction, but 40 simultaneous ones, each person recalibrating in real time, each face changing as the information reorganized itself into something that made sense. An admiral, this woman, in the plain flight suit, who had been pushed against a wall by the facility's commanding officer not 20 minutes ago and had said nothing done, nothing given, no indication, no signal, no correction. Who had been called lost, called small, called irrelevant. Who had stood in perfect stillness while the room laughed. Who had then, without announcement, without permission, without the slightest apparent concern for what anyone thought about it, walked to a terminal and fixed a crisis that 41 trained personnel could not touch. Admiral Diana Cole gave Weston a single nod. Small, precise. Commodore, she said. It was the first time most of them had heard her voice. It was unhurried. Even. It had the quality of someone who had learned over a long time that the words you chose were more important than the number of them you used. Your facility has a structural vulnerability in Protocol Omega's architecture, a recursive error loop triggered by a specific data packet sequence embedded in the Black Spear scenario. The loop creates a compounding false positive that escalates lockdown until it threatens core integrity. She paused not for effect, but because the next sentence was a different thing from the previous ones and deserved its own space. This vulnerability was documented in a technical memo submitted to this command in March of 2019. It was not addressed. She turned her gaze to Harlan. He had not moved from his position beside the command chair. He was still there, hands at his sides, and what had been in his face a moment ago, the rawness, the confusion had begun to change into something else, something slower and more final. Your command staff was not prepared for a systems-level cascade failure, she said. Her voice was the same, not accusing, not cold. A diagnosis delivered the way a good physician delivers a diagnosis, with precision and without cruelty, but without softening either, because softening a diagnosis does not change what it says. They are trained to operate the system. They are not trained to understand it. That is a critical vulnerability. Weston turned to the system's display terminal beside the main holographic projector. He keyed a command sequence. A holographic file appeared in the air to his right. Admiral Diana Cole, USN, United States Cyber Command, Special Operations Directorate, Director Project Chimera. The awards listed in columns: Distinguished Service Medal, Defense Superior Service Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters, Legion of Merit, and below the awards the qualifications: Doctorate in Quantum Computing, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Doctorate in Systems Architecture, California Institute of Technology, Advanced Cyber Warfare Training Program, Naval Designation Classified. And below that, the entry that Mercer read and then read again. Lead Design Architect NCS Cerberus, versions 1.0 through 2.0. The design period 2007 through 2011. She had not wandered into this room. She had built it. Harlan read the file the way a person reads something they cannot stop reading, even when it is causing them pain. His eyes moved through the qualifications and the commendations, and then stopped. Somewhere near the middle of the display, and Mercer, watching him, saw the exact moment that Harlan stopped reading the official record and started reading something else entirely. Something on the wall of his own office, 25 years in the past. Rear Admiral Everett R. Cole, USN Dam Neck Annex, Virginia, September 12, 1998. The signature he had kept his entire career. The name on the woman's file. Cole. He looked at her. She did not look away. There was nothing in her expression that said she had been waiting for him to understand. There was nothing that said she had planned this or expected it or wanted him to feel what he was feeling. There was only that same steady analytical stillness, the stillness of someone whose thoughts were already several steps ahead of the present moment. He had shaken the hand through a signature on a commendation letter of her father. And then this morning he had put his hands on his daughter and pushed her into a wall that bore her name. Weston spoke, and Captain Harlan. Not loud, not harsh, the tone of a man who has decided what comes next and is simply delivering it. You are relieved of command, effective immediately. The Marines will escort you to your quarters. You will await further orders regarding a formal inquiry into the events of this morning. Harlan did not protest. There was nothing left to protest with. He turned toward the aft entrance. The Marines fell into position on either side of him, not roughly, not with ceremony, just the quiet efficiency of people doing a job that required neither. He walked. At the door he stopped. He did not turn around. He stood there for 3 seconds. Perhaps he was looking for something to say. Perhaps he understood at this point that there was nothing. Perhaps the silence was itself the only accurate response to a morning that had dismantled piece by piece everything he had taken to be the foundation of who he was. He walked through the door. It closed behind him. The command deck of NCS Cerberus was quiet. 40 people stood in operational blue light in a room that was working perfectly next to a holographic display showing a war game that had not yet been run. Declan Mercer stood where he had been standing since he stepped in front of Harlan behind and slightly to the left of the secondary engineering terminal, looking at the woman in the plain flight suit who had in 11 minutes done what none of them could do. He thought about the name on the screen. Protocol Everett. He thought about a man who had built something important and had left behind a daughter who understood it well enough to hide a door inside it with her father's name. He thought about what it meant to carry something like that. Not just the knowledge, the whole of it. He did not say anything. He was learning without having been taught it yet that some of the most important things do not require words. Admiral Cole was already looking at the holographic display. The command deck did not return to normal after Harlan left. It returned to something else. A state that looked like normal from the outside console's operational systems, running clean the Black Spear scenario, waiting patiently on the holographic display. The technicians were at their stations. Lieutenant Aldridge had her hands on her keyboard. The overhead lights were blue and steady, but the room had changed in the way that rooms change when something irreversible has happened inside them. Not the furniture, not the equipment, the air itself, or whatever it is that air contains when 40 people have been through something together that none of them have words for yet. Commodore Clifton Weston stood near the holographic display and gave quiet orders to a petty officer on his left. The Black Spear exercise was postponed. The facility would run full systems diagnostics over the next 6 hours. Personnel were to document their recollections of the morning's events in written statements to be submitted to his office by 1800 hours. His voice was even. His face was the face of a man who had been in the Navy for 38 years and understood that the work of an institution does not stop because something significant has happened inside it. If anything, it accelerates. Admiral Diana Cole was standing at the primary command node, not the secondary terminal she had used to fix the system. The primary node, the position she had been standing in when Harlan had found her that morning, the position from which he had pulled her away, the position that bore her family's name on its housing. She was standing there with her tablet open, and she was reading with the patient, thorough attention of someone who has identified a problem and is not satisfied with having solved its immediate expression. Declan Mercer had returned to his station. He was running diagnostics because he had been told to run diagnostics and because running diagnostics was something he knew how to do, and there was comfort after a morning like this one in doing something he knew how to do. But his mind was somewhere else. He kept seeing the name on the tablet screen. Protocol Everett. 2 words visible for 2 seconds gone before he could be certain he had seen them correctly. He was certain he had seen them correctly. He was thinking about what it meant to build something and leave a door and mod it with your father's name. Not just the technical knowledge, though the technical knowledge alone was beyond anything he had encountered in 7 months at Cerberus. The other kind of knowledge. The kind that comes from understanding a system not as a collection of components, but as a living structure with a logic of its own. A logic that can be learned, shaped, spoken to. He was thinking about what kind of person walked into a room and got pushed against a wall and said nothing, did nothing, and then 11 minutes later fixed the thing that 40 trained professionals could not touch. He thought about the answer to that question for a long time. He did not come up with an answer that satisfied him, which meant he was beginning to understand that he had not yet asked the question correctly. Cole stayed for 6 days. She did not stay in the capacity of a commanding officer. She had no formal authority over the day-to-day operations of NCS Cerberus, and she did not exercise any. She did not call meetings. She did not issue directives. She did not stand at the front of rooms and deliver information at people. She moved through the facility the way she moved through most spaces with the quiet, purposeful attention of someone who is gathering information about something that interests them deeply. What interested her was the people. She would appear at a station, not summoned, not scheduled. She would stand behind a technician who was working through a problem and watch for a while, and sometimes she would say nothing at all, and sometimes she would ask a question. A single question, unhurried in the same even voice she used for everything. Why is this written this way? Is there a more efficient path? What happens to this system if that parameter changes by 5%? They were not rhetorical questions. She waited for the answers. She listened to the answers with complete attention, the kind of attention that makes the person being listened to understand that what they say is actually being registered rather than simply received and filed. When the answer was incomplete, she did not supply the rest of it. She asked another question that pointed toward the rest of it and waited. 3 technicians and 1 junior lieutenant had by the 3rd day begun finding reasons to be working near whatever station she happened to be at. Not obviously. Not in the way of people positioning themselves for recognition. In the way of people who have discovered that proximity to a certain kind of thinking is itself instructive, that you learn something just from being near it, even when it is not being directed at you. Mercer was the first one she sought out directly. She found him at 0800 on the 2nd day at his secondary systems analysis station going through the post-incident logs for the 4th time. Not because he had been asked to, because there was something in them he had not yet understood, and he was not willing to move on until he did. She sat down at the empty station beside him. She did not announce herself. He was aware of her the way he had been aware of her on the first morning, a quality of attention in the adjacent space that was distinguishable from the absence of attention, the way a lit window is distinguishable from a dark one. He looked at his screen. He looked at her. "Ensign Mercer," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. "Admiral." She nodded at his screen. "What are you looking for?" He considered the question. Not whether to answer it, how to answer it accurately. "I'm not sure," he said. "There's something in the pre-incident diagnostic sequence that I keep coming back to. A 3% thermal variance that appeared at 0756, 11 seconds before the first alarm. But the variance appeared in a sector that shouldn't have been affected by the Blackspear data packet sequence. If the packet triggered Protocol Omega, the thermal signature should have appeared in the quantum core's primary processing array, not in the secondary coolant distribution network." He paused. "It's like the reaction happened in the wrong place first," he said, "which means either my understanding of the system architecture is wrong or the sequence of events wasn't what the incident report says it was." Cole looked at the screen. She was quiet for a moment. "Your understanding of the architecture is not wrong," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the screen for another moment. Then she looked at him. "Document what you've found, every detail. Do it today. Submit it to Commodore Weston's office marked for my attention." A pause. "Don't discuss it with anyone else until you hear from me." She stood up. She walked away. He opened a new document and began to write. The technical investigation was conducted by a team of 5 analysts from Naval Cyber Command's Independent Review Division, brought to Cerberus on the 3rd day and working out of a secure annex space off the main corridor. They had access to the complete system logs, the post-incident diagnostic reports, and the witness statements that had been submitted to Commodore Weston. They worked in the methodical, unhurried way of people who understand that accuracy is more valuable than speed and that the two are rarely compatible. On the 5th day, the lead analyst submitted a preliminary report to Weston. Weston read it in his office with the door closed. He read it twice. Then he picked up the secure phone on his desk and called a number that was not in any public directory. Cole was in the secondary engineering bay when she received the call. She listened for 40 seconds. She said 2 words and ended the call. She went to find Weston. The report was 9 pages of technical language and 3 pages of conclusions. The technical language described in precise detail what Mercer had identified from the secondary coolant sector, the anomalous origin point of the thermal variance, the pathway by which the Blackspear data packet had reached the Protocol Omega trigger sequence. The pathway was not the standard one. The standard pathway ran through the quantum core's primary processing array. The pathway this packet had taken ran through a secondary routing node that should not have been accessible to a wargame scenario input. It had been made accessible, specifically, deliberately, by a manual modification to the routing parameters that had been entered into the system 12 days before the incident. The modification was small enough to be invisible in a routine sweep. It was precisely targeted at the Protocol Omega trigger architecture, and it had been entered from a terminal with a Level 4 security clearance using valid credentials during a period when the command deck had been running a routine maintenance cycle and the logs were being archived rather than actively monitored. This was not a systems failure. This was sabotage. The conclusion section of the report was 3 pages long. The last paragraph occupied 4 lines. Given the specificity of the modification, the access level required, and the technical knowledge necessary to identify and exploit this particular vulnerability, the perpetrator is assessed with high confidence to be an individual with advanced systems, architecture training, and current or recent authorized access to Cerberus Level 4 infrastructure. The investigation is ongoing. Further findings will be submitted under separate classified cover. Cole read the report once. She set it down on Weston's desk. She picked up a pen and signed the routing slip. Her face did not change while she read it and did not change when she set it down. But Weston, who had known her father and had been watching her for 5 days, with the attention of someone who was relearning how to read a particular language, noticed that she held the pen for a moment after she signed her name. Not long, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. The report was classified the same afternoon. The file sealed, the investigation transferred to a division whose designation appeared in no organizational chart that anyone outside a specific set of cleared personnel had ever seen. She did not ask what came next. Weston did not tell her. Some things in the United States Navy operate best in silence. That evening in the secondary engineering bay, she sat beside Mercer. Mercer at the terminal where he had spent the last 2 days documenting his findings, and she said, "You found it before the analyst did." He looked at his screen. "I didn't know what I found." "You knew something was wrong in the place where the system said nothing was wrong. That's the harder part." She paused. The knowing what it means comes with time. The willingness to keep looking when the official answer seems sufficient, that's the thing that can't be taught. She looked at him directly. "You either have it or you don't." He was quiet for a moment. "The memo," he said, "the one from 2019. You knew this was possible 4 years before it happened." "I knew the structural condition existed that would allow it to happen. I didn't know someone would use it." "But you came anyway." "I came because the condition hadn't been addressed. Whatever the reason for that." She looked at the holographic display at the end of the bay, running a low-level test pattern, blue and steady. A vulnerability that isn't corrected is an invitation. Eventually, someone accepts the invitation. It doesn't matter whether they find it by accident or by design. He thought about that. He thought about the modification in the routing parameters. 12 days before the incident. A terminal, a level 4 clearance, advanced architecture knowledge. He did not ask the question out loud. She did not answer it. They sat in the quiet for a while, 2 people in a room full of working systems, and the silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms between people who are thinking about the same things from different distances. On the morning of the 6th day, she left. No ceremony, no formation. She walked to her rental car in the parking lot with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything, carrying nothing except the tablet and the small nylon pouch with the data cable inside it. Weston walked her out. They spoke briefly at the car, too quietly for anyone else to hear, and then she got in and drove east on the access road toward Route 50. Mercer watched from the window of the secondary systems bay. He watched the car until the desert absorbed it. He stood at the window for a while after that, looking at the Nevada landscape, which had the same opinion about human events that it always did. 3 weeks later at Fort Bliss Army Base in El Paso, Texas, Captain Reed Harlan was doing inventory. Not metaphorically, literally. He was standing in a warehouse the size of a city block, holding a clipboard counting pallets of electronic components scheduled to be transferred to Cerberus as part of a routine hardware refresh cycle. 22 pallets, 47 line items, standard grid navigation hardware processing unit, subcomponents, fiber relay modules. He had been at Fort Bliss for 19 days. The official record said he was on administrative reassignment pending review. The unofficial understanding, which everyone in his chain of command shared without needing to articulate it, was that he was here because of what he had done on November 14th, and the question of whether he would leave was substantially less certain than the question of whether he had arrived. He was not good at inventory. He was not built for the patience that inventory requires, the methodical checking of one number against another number, the willingness to spend 6 hours confirming that what should be somewhere is, in fact, there. He was a man who had spent 2 decades in command spaces operating at the speed of decisions, and the warehouse moved at the speed of pallets. But he was doing the inventory. He was doing it because there was nothing else to do, and because somewhere in the process of standing in a warehouse in the Texas desert counting fiber relay modules under fluorescent light, something was happening to Reed Harlan that he did not have a name for yet. He was paying attention. Not the version of attention he had spent 2 decades performing, the posture, the eye contact, the engaged nod, timed for maximum effect. The real kind, the kind that asked nothing back. He was looking at the numbers on the clipboard and checking them against the numbers on the pallets and registering the results without having already decided what the results should be. He was beginning to understand the first genuinely useful thing he had done in years. On the 17th pallet, the numbers were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that announces itself, the kind of wrong that is easy to miss if you are not paying attention and nearly invisible if you have already decided that everything is probably fine. 6 fiber relay modules listed on the transfer manifest were not the fiber relay modules that had arrived on the pallet. They were the same model number, the same manufacturer's designation. They were not the same components. He looked at them for a long time. The model numbers matched. But the manufacturing batch codes on the physical units did not match the batch codes on the original purchase order, which he found in the transfer documentation after 20 minutes of looking. The batch codes indicated that these units had been manufactured 18 months after the purchase order had been issued. That was not possible if the units were the originals. He checked the other pallets. 3 more discrepancies. Different components, same pattern. Model numbers matching, batch codes wrong. The replacements were not visibly defective. They were simply not what the manifest said they were. Someone had switched them, carefully, with enough technical knowledge to know which components to replace and which to leave, with enough access to the supply chain to make the switch before the transfer documentation was finalized. He stood in the warehouse with the clipboard in his hands for a very long time. He thought about what this meant. He thought about who had the technical knowledge to know which components mattered. He thought about the routing modification in the server system architecture 12 days before the incident, the detail that had appeared in the investigation summary delivered to him as part of his administrative review packet. A summary whose conclusions he had read 3 times, trying to understand the shape of the thing that had happened on November 14th, trying to understand it not from the inside where he had been helpless, but from the outside where the geometry was clearer. The modified components, the sabotaged routing parameters, the specific technical knowledge required for both. He thought about these things for a long time. He took his phone out of his pocket. He put it back. He picked up the clipboard. He spent the next 3 weeks documenting everything. He did not tell his supervising officer at Fort Bliss what he was doing. He did not request additional resources or flag the discrepancy through the standard logistics reporting channel, which would have routed the information to a supply chain administrator who would have logged it as a maintenance issue and scheduled a component review in the following fiscal quarter. He documented it himself, methodically, in the careful, systematic way that he had learned to write reports at Annapolis and had used through the first decade of his career before ambition had redirected his attention. He built the record the way you build a record when you want it to be useful to the person who receives it. Complete, cross-referenced, clear. He cross-referenced the batch code discrepancies against the Cerberus hardware installation logs from the previous 18 months, which he requested through a routine administrative access channel. He found 6 installation events that corresponded to the compromised components. He mapped the installation timeline against the Cerberus system access logs. He identified a window. It was narrow, but it was there. On a Tuesday morning in the 4th week of December, he sat in his quarters at Fort Bliss at 0600 and wrote a report. Short sentences where short sentences were sufficient. Numbers where numbers were relevant. No hedging, no performance. He did not put his name on it. He addressed it to the office of Admiral Diana Cole, U.S. Cyber Command, Special Operations Directorate, via the postal routing number that appeared in the unclassified portion of the Cerberus facility's external communications directory. He sent it through the Fort Bliss Mail Processing Center at 0730. He went back to the warehouse. He counted pallets. The report arrived at Cole's office on a Thursday. Her assistant flagged it as unclassified, no sender identification Fort Bliss postmark. She set it aside until the end of the day, when she read things that arrived outside the normal channels, and she opened it at her desk at 1820 with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour before. She read it. She read it again. The Fort Bliss postmark. The content. The structure of it, the way the sentences were built, the way the evidence was organized, each element cross-referenced to the next in a sequence that moved toward a conclusion without announcing that it was doing so, letting the evidence construct the argument rather than constructing the argument first and selecting the evidence to fit. She had read thousands of reports in her career, written by officers at every level of the service from ensigns to vice admirals, and the way a person wrote a report when they wrote it in earnest and not for an audience told you something real about how they thought. Not what they knew, how they thought. She recognized this. Not the writing of the man who had walked the command deck with his hands clasped behind his back, projecting authority at a room that had already decided to see it. The writing of the man who had scored in the 94th percentile on a systems analysis assessment 25 years ago and received a commendation from an admiral whose name he had kept on his wall without ever learning whose name it was. She put the report down. She sat with it for a moment. Then she picked up the secure phone and made a call. She did not say Harlan's name on the call. She did not confirm the sender. She gave 3 numbers and a location reference and asked for an investigation to be opened, and the person on the other end of the call confirmed it would be. She did not call Fort Bliss. She did not send acknowledgement to the anonymous address. She finished her cold coffee. She thought about how long it took some people to become who they might have been. She filed the report in a secure folder. 6 weeks after that, a man named Victor Leland, a lieutenant commander assigned to Cerberus Facility Support Operations with Level 4 clearance and a systems architecture background that predated his assignment by 4 years, submitted a resignation from the Naval Service for personal reasons. The resignation was accepted with unusual speed. His security clearances were suspended pending a routine separation review. The separation review was not routine. None of this appeared in any press release. None of it was announced internally. The investigation that Harlan's anonymous report had helped open had found its target quietly in the way that the most consequential investigations tend to operate, without a sound, without ceremony, and without any public acknowledgement that would have required explaining what had been found and how. Cole knew, Weston knew, and somewhere in a warehouse in El Paso, Texas, Reed Harlan received a form letter confirming that his administrative review had been completed and that his reassignment status would be evaluated in the following quarter. The letter said nothing else. He understood everything else. He set the letter down on his desk. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his clipboard and walked back to the warehouse floor where a new shipment had arrived that morning and the batch codes needed checking. Declan Mercer received the package on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of January. No return address. Plain brown packaging, sealed with standard shipping tape, his name and the Cerberus facility address written in block letters that were deliberately nondescript. Inside the packaging, wrapped in a single layer of clean gray foam, was a data slate. Standard issue in form, not standard in content. He powered it on. The screen loaded a directory, a single folder. He opened it. Source code. Not a summary, not a simplified version, not a training document. The actual foundational source code for the NCS Cerberus operating system versions 1.0 through 2.0 in its original form from its original development period. 743 files. Decades of accumulated systems architecture philosophy distilled into a structure that had taken 4 years to build and had been running beneath everything he had been trained to operate since the year he was 12 years old. He scrolled. The annotations appeared as he moved deeper into the files. Not typed, written by hand, and photographs scanned into the margins of the code pages in red ink. Not explanations of what the code did. Questions. The same kind of questions she had asked at his station. Why is this written this way? What does this assume about the system's behavior at this boundary? Is there a more efficient path here? And if there is, why wasn't it taken? And occasionally something more personal. A single line in the margin of a dense architecture file in the same red ink, in the same handwriting. Your grandfather would have started here. He sat with the data slate in his hands for a long time. He was not thinking about the code. He was thinking about what it meant to give something like this. Not to an institution, not to a program or a curriculum or an official mentorship structure. To a person. An ensign with 7 months in service and a habit of looking at things until they made sense. To give it with no note, no instruction, no attached obligation. Just the thing itself, and the implicit understanding that the thing itself was enough. That if you understood why it was being given, you understood what to do with it. He thought about Protocol Everett, a door built into a system with a father's name, a failsafe that had waited 12 years for the one moment it was needed and had been exactly sufficient for that moment and nothing more. The architecture of trust between a daughter and the man who had taught her that efficiency was its own form of elegance, that you never used 10 words when 2 would suffice, that the most important things you built were the ones only you could maintain, and that the way you made sure they survived you was to teach someone else to understand them. Not to operate them, to understand them. He thought about what it meant to be the person she had decided to give that to. He closed the data slate carefully, set it on his desk, sat in his chair for a long time in the quiet of his quarters on the Fallon base, listening to the Nevada wind move against the window. Then he opened the data slate again and began to read from the beginning. The brass plate was a small thing, 3 inches by 5, brushed steel border black lettering. It was screwed into the face of the server rack bulkhead in Module 7 of the Cerberus primary command node on the last Friday of January, attached by Petty Officer Whitfield, who had escorted Admiral Cole from the checkpoint gate on the morning of November 14th, and who had been asked by Commodore Weston to handle the installation personally. Admiral's corner. No dates, no explanation, no citation of events. The name of the place and nothing else, because the people who needed to understand it would understand it, and the people who didn't would learn. The installation took 4 minutes. Whitfield photographed it for the facility record, wrote a single-line entry in the maintenance log, and went back to his desk. In the main corridor of the administrative wing, on the wall beside the photograph of the change of command ceremony, which had not been replaced, Weston had ordered a second photograph hung. He had done it in the last week of November, pulling the image from the facility's internal security footage archive, having it printed at 12 by 16 framed in plain black. He had not written a memo about it. He had not filed an explanation. He had simply told Petty Officer Whitfield where to put it, and Whitfield had put it there, and that was the end of the paperwork. No ceremony in the photograph. No handshakes, no formation, no flags. A secondary engineering terminal portside, and a data cable running from the maintenance port to a tablet held by a woman in a plain flight suit, and the holographic display in the background just beginning to show the first thin circle of white light pushing back the dark. Below it, in the same plain black frame, a single printed line. Efficiency is its own form of elegance. No attribution, no name. The people who needed to know, whose words they were already knew. 3 months after the Cerberus incident, on a Tuesday morning in February, the Secondary Systems Analysis Bay was running a scheduled training session for 6 newly arrived ensigns, fresh from the pipeline, carrying the combination of technical preparation and operational inexperience that the pipeline produced, and that the real work of a facility like Cerberus was designed to correct. They were seated at the analysis stations in a row. 6 faces, young, attentive, carrying the residual alertness of people who are trying to perform competence before they have fully assembled it. Declan Mercer stood in front of them. He had been promoted to lieutenant junior grade in December, a promotion that Weston had pushed through the administrative process with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided something and was not interested in waiting for the machinery to agree. He was 24 years old. He had been at Cerberus for 10 months. He was the youngest person at the facility to conduct primary training for incoming personnel, and no one had questioned it because the people who had been in the secondary systems bay on the morning of November 14th had stopped needing to question things about Mercer some time ago. He looked at the 6 faces. He thought about what she had given him, not the data slate, the question. He pulled up the system architecture on the training display. A segment of the Cerberus Operational Interface Standard presentation, the view that new technicians were shown in their first week, the view that showed the system as it was meant to be operated. He pointed to a specific node in the routing architecture. This sequence. His voice was level, unhurried. Look at how it's written. He waited. He gave them time to actually look at it rather than glancing and responding, which was what most people did when given a moment they hadn't planned for. He gave them enough silence that the silence became its own instruction. He looked at the display. He looked at them. Why is it written this way? The question landed in the room and sat there, not rhetorical, not decorative, not the kind of question that contains its own answer if you listen carefully enough to the tone. A real question, open-ended, pointing towards something that they did not yet know was there, something that would take time and attention and the willingness to keep looking when the surface seemed sufficient. One of the ensigns leaned forward slightly. That was enough. Outside, the Nevada desert was the same as it had always been, pale and vast and absolute in its indifference. The sagebrush did not care. The mountains did not care. The sky above Fallon was the color of a cold, clean morning, and inside the wire inside the building that did not appear on any map you could access, a room full of people were learning something that no pipeline and no checklist and no official training program had ever found a way to teach. That the most powerful people in any room are often the ones you would never notice. The ones who don't need to wear their authority on their collars because their authority is written into the fabric of the world around them. The ones who build the doors that no one else knows are there. And the ones who teach the next generation not how to operate the system, but how to understand it, how to carry it, How to leave a door open with someone's name on it for the day it needs to be found. The circle, quiet and unbroken, goes on.